So it's the next day, resin's gone nice and hard. I've trimmed the majority of the excess off there with a razor blade because it's so thin. But the first step this morning is going to be to clean up the top section of this area. So you can see kind of right in there, there's a bit of a gap. So we want to just sand this down so that the next layer of socket connection lays flat on the fuselage and doesn't have this lump. So very carefully just going to sand that without hitting the fuselage while it's still in position. Then we'll break the fuselage out of position, clean up the back, rough up all of this area ready for the next lamination, and then we're ready to do the second stage of this socket connection. So with that sanded and cleaned up, you can see it's sort of flush now with the top without actually hitting the aluminium, and it's time to remove it from this socket. So to remove it from to break it out of this socket connection, a couple of different ways. I've done it before where I've put the fuselage in the vise and tried to like bang the wing up, but it's so fragile on the trailing edge, I didn't really like that. You can also clamp the wing and try and put a bolt into here or just a screw and tap up as well, so that it's sort of, you try and bang it out that way. You can also put it kind of face down like this and tap down like that and try and break it out of the socket that way, but it is kind of somewhat wrapped over the radius that we've done on the fuselage, so you kind of have to wiggle it and play around with it and sort of break it out however you have to. Okay, and then we have it. So with the fuselage released, the next step is just to clean up the trailing edge. So cut it and then sand it. So that's all sanded up now, ready for the next lamination. You just want to make sure everything's rough, no shiny patches at this point. So then I've prepared my fiberglass. This is 6 layers, so we've got 6 patches of 6-ounce fiberglass. They range from 50 millimeters, the smallest one. It's about 50 or 60 millimeters. So I've got 2 at 50 millimeters, 2 at 75 millimeters, 1 at about 150 millimeters, and then 1 at about 200 millimeters. We start with the smallest ones and we start to build our way out. And this largest patch, you can see I've just taped off sort of on either side of it so we don't get resin everywhere. So before we start the lamination, we need to refit the fuselage. So we're going to re-wax this. So leave the tape exactly how it is, but give it a good another coat of wax and refit it onto the wing. So I've mixed up 45 grams of resin, and we're going to start with the 2 smallest patches, about 50 or 60 millimeters, just shy of the leading edge, like so, right in the center, and start to saturate these out. And so you want to force this down and get rid of all those air bubbles to start with. We're going to have to continue working it, but doing it in this sort of multiple layer approach lets you get this nice and tight, which is really hard if you put all 6 layers on at once. Okay, so once it's all saturated out, you're just doing your best now to sort of remove any air bubbles, make sure it's flat on the fuselage there, make sure it's connected to the sides, and it's hard to sort of get all the air bubbles out of this. So a good move is to do the best you can now, and then come back in a couple of hours and actually like press this back in when the resin has gelled off a little bit. You can kind of like stick it to the exact position you want, and it'll hold a little better. You can also just try and remove any major excesses. We don't want huge drips, but we do want full saturation here, so it's going to be easy to sand for the next connection. Okay, so that's it. So like I said, I'll come back in about 2 hours, force any of this back in if it's lifted at all, make sure there's no air bubbles, and then we'll let it cure. Alright, so the resin has now gone nice and hard, so we'll pop the fuselage out of the socket, and then we'll do exactly the same process. I'll just quickly go and cut the back off, sand that flat, and also sand the leading edge here. So now with the back cleaned up and the leading edge cleaned up, you want to blend that sort of nicely that the leading edge is the perfect curve again, because the next step is to now laminate the top again for our second layer. So very similar to how we did this first layer of carbon, we're going to be doing a tack set with a cut lap. However, there are a couple of small differences. The first difference is that with the cut lap, if you remember, we ran it off the corner for the first layer. For this layer, we're going to allow the cut lap around the corner there and allow this wingtip material carbon to actually fold over, and will create a lap around the wingtip as well. It adds a lot of impact resistance to the wingtip. The second difference is that as well as the 6-ounce carbon layer, we'll be laying a 6-ounce fiberglass cloth on top. So we'll tack set the carbon layer, wrap it around, and then we'll lay the 6-ounce fiberglass cloth on top, saturate that, squeegee it out like we'd normally run 6-ounce or fiberglass, and that will come around the cut lap as well, and it'll also wrap around the wingtips as well, and it really makes everything stiff and strong and high impact resistance. So the first step is just to make sure that it's sanded really well. You want to make sure it's all dulled off, so we're going to get that mechanical adhesion with the resin, and then we'll tape up the cut lap. So one thing I just forgot to mention is you want to make sure that you try and get some tape inside that socket connection so the resin doesn't drip through the holes. I learned that the hard way. Very hard to remove that resin afterwards. So try and get some tape into that socket, and then I've mixed up 75 grams of resin right now. Same deal, small paintbrush. We're going to paint around the cut lap and all over the surface. Okay, with a nice dry brush, just getting any of that excess off, and then we'll give this about 2 hours or so, let it get tacky, and we'll come back and lay the carbon. Okay, so the resin has now gone sticky, not sticking to the glove, but it's definitely sticky. So we're going to start with our carbon layer. Very much the same process as before. Lay it down, smooth it out. So with it stuck, the next step is to trim it closer to size. Then I'm also going to make a couple of relief cuts again to fold it under. We don't want to make a relief cut on the same spot as before, so cutting a small wedge right on the corner of the wingtip to allow it to fold over in 3 different pieces. Then we can go ahead and fold it all under, starting from the center and stretching it out. And this time we're going to fold the wingtips under as well. Okay, so now we're ready for the fiberglass. So we can lay the fiberglass cloth on top, dry, and then trim it to size. The same deal, leaving around about 50 millimeters to lap here, so it goes all the way around the lap and up onto the masking tape. It's a good idea to trim the corners off the trailing edge so that you don't end up with an air bubble underneath it, because the weight of the cloth will actually pull it down and create an air bubble. And you also want to press into your screw holes again. That's how we're going to locate those holes, and also that helps the screw head seat. And then just going around making sure that all the laps are pulled in nice and tight. It all goes back to the masking tape, and you might be able to see this texture in the light. The texture of the cloth, that's what we're sort of looking for, so not overly saturated. We want this to be very well saturated. I'd rather have more resin here than not enough. But yeah, you're looking for that texture in the fiberglass cloth. It's going to make the next step easier. And then we can let this set up. So you can see now we have this lap, and it's added this bit of thickness all around the wingtips and everything. And so what I like to do now is go and blend this back out. It removes a lot of the fiberglass that we've lapped, but still leaves the fiberglass that's kind of wrapping around the actual wingtip. So it just adds that bit of impact resistance there. So we'll clean all of this up, trim the trailing edge again, and then we're ready to laminate the bottom. Okay, so I've just sanded it up. It's ready for the bottom lamination. A couple of quick things to note. Using the sander on its edge there just to carve this cut lap down, make it a nice smooth transition. What you're basically doing is sanding through the fiberglass, touching the carbon of the cut lap without touching the carbon of the bottom lamination. Removing all of the tape there, any sticky residue, making sure this is clean. So I go with the power sander first, and then just clean this up by hand. Also, just by hand going over the leading edge, making sure this is really smooth, particularly those areas where we did the relief cuts, they create bumps. And then roughing up all of the surface, all around the socket connection, smoothing out everything, making sure we're ready for the next lamination. One more thing is right on the wingtips. you might be able to see the fiberglass was bubbled slightly, so I've sanded off the fiberglass. It's exposed just the lap of carbon. So we're ready now for the final lamination, the underside of the wing, and similar to how we just did the top lamination, we'll use one layer of carbon fiber and then we'll tack set that, wrap it all around this complex curve area, and then we'll do one layer of 6-ounce cloth on top of that, saturate all of that resin out, very similar to how we just did the top. However, we will not be doing a cut lap, so this time we just run it flat, similar to how we did the bottom with the original layup. So first step, of course, is just to tape up, make sure we're not going to get any drips anywhere, oversize cut our carbon and our fiberglass, and then we're going to mix up some resin. I like to bring the masking tape a little higher on the leading edge here so that it's easier to sand off because we're not wrapping too much fiberglass around. And then I've mixed up 45 grams of resin and just painted on nice and thin like we have with the other layers. Okay, so the resin has now tacked off. It's sticky, but it's not coming up on the glove. And it's time to lay up the carbon. Because we have to go over this very complex curve, it's a little hard to hold everything. And so it's a good idea to actually lay some sticks. Make sure they're not going to stick, but that, yep, looks okay. Just to help hold the carbon up while we lay it. Then you can drape the carbon over so you know it's in a good position. It's nicely centered there, like so, enough over the back. Then you can just start to work it down and around the socket. And then lift up one side, remove all your sticks, and we're going to gently rub this side on. Like so. Then you can lay the fiberglass on, trim that, and then I'm pouring the resin. I mixed up 120 grams of resin. Spread that all around. Remember, we want enough saturation to go through the fiberglass, but also all the way through the carbon. So really sort of pull it around, let it really saturate all the way through those layers. Once you've got good saturation and a few minutes, at least 5 minutes have passed, so you know it's soaked through, you can start to squeegee it out to take out some of that excess and just put it back in the pot. I also like to flex the squeegee so that it's matching the curve of the camber, so we're not digging in corners with a straight squeegee. So you're sort of flexing with your thumb to give it a little bit of shape. And one other thing is, if you continuously are dragging out towards the wingtips, it'll pull air bubbles in the corner here where it sort of slowly drags the fiberglass away. So just remember to kind of alternate your direction, bring that in, up into the corner, and you're just making sure that that is all nice and tight. And there we have it. So you can see that's formed really well around the socket. Still lots of shiny patches. I prefer to keep this oversaturated than undersaturated. We've just rolled the leading edge down a little bit because we're just going to sand that off so it doesn't need to wrap. So I've just saturated as much as I need there. But that is all in position. So we'll let that set up. Okay, so the resin has gone nice and hard now. And that's it for laminating. So from this point on, we're just going to be sanding and filler coating with the epoxy resin. And so the first step today is going to be to clean this up really neatly. This is our final chance to make sure all of our lines, bumps, everything's very smooth. We're going to clean up around the wingtips, make sure the trailing edge is the perfect shape that we want. Carefully sand along the leading edge here, taking off the excess but not burning through anything. Really making sure that this is our perfect, smooth, finished shape without actually accidentally going through any fiberglass, of course. So really carefully sanding it now, and then we'll move on to the hot coat. So from this point on, all we're going to do is paint it with resin and then smooth out the resin. And so, like I said, lots of attention right now to getting it perfect, and also sanding any shiny patches. Like, it's still got a lot of texture there with the fiberglass, but also got some shiny patches where I had a little too much resin, and so just smoothing it all out, getting ready for that hot coat. So let's get into it. Okay, so it's all sanded up now. I've gone over it and over it to make sure it's really smooth. Really making sure that you don't burn through. Like I say, in all of my sanding videos, this is a time when you could really destroy your whole project by accidentally sanding through all of the layers. So carefully just making sure that I went to where the tape was, but not too far on the leading edge. Blended the underside of the leading edge back, so you can see that sort of curve there. So sort of rolling that back over, and really working on the trailing edge as well, slimming that out, making it nice and smooth. And you can almost see here where I've sanded through the fiberglass, this sort of black matte, that's actually carbon. So I've really tried to slim out into the trailing edge there. Of course, that's all solid there where we have the overhang from the trailing edge, but just wanted, really fine tuning all of this right now, making sure that we're really happy. Going over it with the palm sander first. The random orbital sander, if you can sort of maybe see these white patches, they were slight lumps, right? And the random orbital just sort of no pressure, just buzzing it over the top there, just hits any of those highs off really well and flattens everything out. And then hand sanding it all to make sure it feels really smooth. Again, not burning through everything, so just paying attention to not going too far, but getting it nice and smooth. Also, just sanding all around the socket connection here, just making sure everything's smooth. I don't want to go on and on about it, but this is sort of our last opportunity to make sure all of our shape is perfect. Slimming out into the wingtips, making sure our curves are all around the leading edge are nice, and we're ready to hot coat. So let's mix up some resin. So I've just mixed up 130 grams of resin, and a nice way to do this is actually fit the fuselage back into position and then tape around right where the fuselage joins there, even a little bit back, like so. So when that squeezes in, and now we can paint the entire wing without getting resin on the fuselage, and then just balance it in position. Like so, and we can paint the entire thing. And we just go ahead and paint it. So once it's all wet out, you want to remove a lot of the excess so that you don't have pooling or drips. Doing it this way definitely leads to some drips on the underside, whatever side you leave face down. So it's a good idea to come back in half an hour or 20 minutes, half an hour, an hour. Just keep monitoring it and just wiping any drips that might form. Okay, so it's the next day and the resin has gone hard. You can see very close to finish now. Really nice, clean looking finish on the wing. And today's step is to sand it. So you might be able to see in the light a couple of sort of little bit wavy, a few little lumps, even when I was sort of brushing this out as the resin was setting, it still leaves this kind of wavy look. So the goal now is to sand that flat and get a really nice flat finish for the foil without going through and hitting all of that weave or carbon again. So leaving that thin layer of resin over everything so it doesn't expose any of the fibers. Okay, so before we get sanding, I'm just going to re-drill out our holes and then we'll countersink them as well. So get the screw heads seated nicely. The drill bit will probably find the hole that we already drilled unless it completely filled with resin, so you can kind of look in there. You know, actually the first one kind of looks like it has filled with resin, so we still want to sort of measure and make sure we're getting it right, but hopefully it will re-find its own hole and go straight back through it. But if not, make sure we're going to drill this accurately again, and then just countersinking down enough that the screw heads will sit nice and flat. And that's sort of why we've pressed all of those fibers down, so now we can countersink into this resin and we're not going to really affect all of the fibers of the carbon and fiberglass. So as soon as we've done that, I'm going to start sanding. A couple of tips for sanding. I'm going to start with the power sander, so just a random orbital sander, 80 grit, and just hit the highs off very gently, very light pressure, and then move to hand sanding. So sanding with a block and some sandpaper, 120 grit, 240 grit, 320 grit, and moving to wet and dry. So with the 320, I start doing soap and water, 320 grit wet and dry, then 600 wet and dry with the soap and water, over it and over it and over, round and round and round and round, and that gives it a really nice satin finish. And the 600 grit is something that I like to use with my foils. That said, if you want to take it higher to a different grit, you can. If you want to finish it in a different way, this would be the moment that you can do that as well. You can spray paint it with an automotive clear, or you could give it another whole coat of resin, so a finishing coat of resin. You can do that same process that we've just done again. So if you find that you sand it and you've hit too much weave and it's not looking perfect, you can literally just keep it at around about 120 grit and then paint it again with resin, so you've got another layer to hit, and then you can just gently sand that with sandpaper and a block, right? So a couple of different options for finishing. Like I said though, for me, I just sand it up to 600 grit, wet and dry, going round and round, and I find that that really works for me. So let's do it. It's quite a nice snug fit there in the socket, so that's great. I did have to just sort of put a bit of pressure on the bottom side of that hole. That one was just slightly misaligned, so you can just play around with that a little bit, and I've countersunk now down so the head is just slightly proud, but that means we get really good connection on top of all of those layers. So now I've been over it several times with the 320 grit. It's feeling very smooth, everything feels good. I'm gonna move to the 600 grit. Same deal, go over it several times with the 600. With everything, a couple of last details. I wrap the wet and dry over the trailing edge and I just sort of give that last little curve to the back of the trailing edge there. Make that, soften that up and sort of almost sharpen it slightly as well at the same time, making sure that it sort of comes to a nice little point. All the way around all the wing tips. Just want to make sure everything feels smooth. It does a great job of smoothing everything out. And once you're done, it's time to rinse this off. So I'll just go and rinse it under the hose, wipe it all down, get it really clean, and then we can put our finish sealer on top. Okay, so that's dry now. And that is a ready to fly hydrofoil wing. What I'm going to do is seal it at this point using a floor sealer, Rejuvenate or similar. And this is really good at just hiding scratches and just any weave that maybe we just touched, if there's any minor sort of imperfections. And I do just want to say again that you could paint this with a clear automotive paint. That's probably the industry standard, is to paint it, but I really like this resin finish. I like to be able to resurface it if I want to, repair any little scratches without having to sort of sand through that paint layer and then repaint everything. And I like to be able to just sort of sand it with the grits that I want. So I sort of really like the resin finish, but you could of course paint it. It's a really good way to get a very sharp finish to really cover any weave and things like that. But like I said, for me personally, I'm going to give it just some floor sealer, finish it off, and then it's ready to fly. So the way we're going to do it is we just give it 3 or 4 coats of this 5 minutes apart, and then we'll just Scotch-Brite it off, or with the 600 grit again, and just give it that surface again. And like I said, it'll seal everything up. So let's do it. So I've given this 3 coats about 10 minutes apart, and that is now dry. And just to finish it, just rub over it with a Scotch pad. You could also use a 600 grit sandpaper and just literally go over it. We'll just take any little specks, give it back that slight and there we have it, a completed hydrofoil front wing. Very excited to get this on the water and give it a test. Lots of processes, obviously. It takes a bit of time with all the processes, but ends up quite a nice result. So I'm happy with the shape. I'm happy with the way it laid up. I'm excited to try this sort of proportionately designed front wing where we've really focused on those proportions instead of just creating a shape that we want. And this higher aspect, slightly wider wingspan than my previous foil, so I'm going to get it straight up on the para wing first. So we'll be testing it out on the para wing first, and I'm literally heading to the lake right now, so really excited to give it a test. So like I said, hopefully that video was helpful, and if it was and you end up making a foil for yourself, please share it with me. I'm stoked to hear about people that are making their own foils. So that is it for this video. So in the next video, we're going to be focusing on building the stabilizer wing. So I hope to see you in that one, and I can't wait to get this on the water. So see you there.